The honourable member for Carleton is rising on a point of privilege.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker. You've noticed from me of a point of privilege. I'm rising today because the government's imposition of a new tax without needed approval of the House of Commons has breached the privileges of all members and has done so in contravention of Standing Orders 79.1, 80, 83.1, as well as principles laid out in pages 827, 828, 829, 831, 833, 835, 841, 893, and pages 906 through 908 of Bosque and Gagnon, House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition, 2017, and numerous rulings by your chair, and most important of all, Section 53 of the Constitution Act, 1867. In essence, I'm rising today to ask, Mr. Chair, that you find a prima facie case of breach of privilege because of the government's imposition of a secretive and insidious tax designed to raise funds for it to spend at the expense of the Canadian people without holding appropriate votes in the House of Commons and possibly in direct contravention of other laws that have been passed by this House. The new tax of which I speak is designed to raise more money for the government to spend. In fact, it raised more money for the government to spend in the last fiscal year than all other sources of revenue combined. This tax should be called the inflation tax. I speak of this illegal inflation tax in which the government is funding its spending with newly created currency that increases consumer prices through the levy of inflation. Let me clarify the difference before I go any further between inflation and the inflation tax. It is not a tax when, independent and separate from government, consumer prices rise due to supply and demand dynamics. However, when they rise because the government and central bank coordinate to expand the money supply, thus raising consumer prices above what they would otherwise be, and force consumers to pay what they would otherwise pay, that is a tax. I do not raise this point of privilege lightly, but after careful consideration of the nature of the government's actions and their real-world effects on Canadians, both of which I have described. As well, I rely heavily on the jurisprudence from your chair and the clear legal definitions of a tax. To prove this breach, I would have to show 3 parts. First, that there is a privilege for members of Parliament at stake, and that privilege is that governments cannot tax what the House does not expressly approve through votes by each member in the chamber. Second, I would need to prove that the policy in fact imposes a tax. And finally, I would need to provide proof that the House did not approve this tax. Together, these points prove that the government committed a prima facie case of breach of my parliamentary privilege by denying me the opportunity to vote on this tax increase before it took effect. So let me start with the first part. Is there a privilege for each member to vote on any new taxes introduced or imposed on Canadians? The answer is yes. In fact, this privilege on Canadian soil originated with the British North American Act, Section 53 of the Constitution. It is clear. Bills for appropriating any part of the public revenue or for imposing any tax or impost shall originate in the House of Commons. End quote. This constitutional principle is further enshrined in Standing Order 80-1, which says all aids and supplies granted to the sovereign by the Parliament of Canada are the sole gift of the House of Commons, and all bills for granting such aids and supplies ought to begin with the House, as it is the undoubted right of the House to direct, limit, and appoint in all such bills the ends, purposes, considerations, conditions, limitations, and qualifications of such grants which are not alterable by the Senate. The failure of this House to, quote, direct, limit, and appoint revenue-raising measures is accordingly not only a violation of the Constitution, but also of the privileges of members of the House set out in the standing orders. In the Urig estate case, the courts considered the constitutional implications of a tax raised through such improper and indirect means. Mr. Justice Jack Major, writing for the majority, wrote that Section 53 of the Constitution codifies the principle of no taxation without representation by requiring any bill that imposes a tax to originate with the legislature. End quote. And I requote him again. My interpretation of Section 53 prohibits not only the Senate but also any body other than the directly elected legislature from imposing a tax on its own accord, end quote. Any other body. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, the Justice Major made clear that it is his interpretation that no body other than the House of Commons can initiate a tax increase. And I would submit that includes no body includes the Bank of Canada itself in collaboration with the government. When the court said that there should be no taxation without representation, it got to the heart of my point here today. And I'm going to quote the court again. The Lieutenant Governor in Council cannot impose a new tax ab initio without the authorization of the legislature. And the Governor in Council has no power priorio vigore to impose taxes unless under the authority specifically delegated to it by statute. The power of taxation is exclusively in Parliament, end quote. The court went on to say that Section 53 ensures that parliamentary control over and accountability for taxation, and quoted the distinguished legal scholar Elmer Dredger, who, as follows: through the centuries, the principle was maintained that taxation required representation and consent. The only body in Canada that meets this test is the Commons. The elected representatives of the people sit in the Commons, and consistently with history and tradition, they may well insist that they alone have the right to decide to the last cent what money is to be granted and what taxes are to be imposed, end quote. Elsewhere, the court held in the West Bank First Nation case, similarly, that, quote, the Canadian Constitution through the operation of Section 53 of the Constitution Act 1867 demands that there should be no taxation without representation. In other words, individuals being taxed in a democracy have the right to have their elected representatives debate whether their money should be appropriated and determine how it should be spent, end quote. Peter Hogg, who until his death last year was Canada's leading constitutional scholar, underscored the point that I am making now in a 2002 article. It must, quote, it must be remembered that the taxing power is one upon which the rest of government depends, as the King and Parliament both recognized in the 17th century. Nothing important can be done without resources, and it is control of the taxing power that provides the resources. Moreover, no other power has direct and immediate effect on citizens as the taxing power, and for that reason, nothing the government does is as unpopular as the imposition and collection of taxes. There is a huge incentive for governments to offload this power to a delegate who can raise taxes quietly without any irritating fuss in Parliament or the legislature, and who can shoulder the blame when the media do get wind of the action. end quote. As Professor Hogg noted, this is not a new problem. In fact, it's one of the oldest and most important matters in the system of parliamentary democracy. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that taxation is the reason we are all here today. The Crown's power to tax and the need to obtain consent of those paying the taxes is why Parliament exists in the first place. And you can look at 800 years of history going back to the Magna Carta to find that the principal disagreement between Crown and Commoner has been on the subject of taxation. And so it is essential to the privileges of every member of this House that every single levy or tax come before us to be voted on before it is enacted. So I think I have clearly proven that it is the privilege of every member to vote on a tax increase before it is imposed. So what is the tax of which I speak? The answer is it is the inflation tax. Now, is inflation excessive inflation, which results from excessive money creation, in fact, a tax? Well, look to the definition of a tax found in Oxford Languages, a 150-year-old dictionary, which defines taxes as follows. Quote, a compulsory contribution to state revenue levied by the government on workers' income and business profits or added to the cost of some goods, services, and transactions. So I will break down that definition. First, that it is state revenue levied by the government. Second, that it is added to the cost of some goods, services, and transactions. And third, that it is a compulsory contribution. So, first, is the inflation tax designed to generate state revenue levied by the government? Well, I will give you the data to prove that, in fact, it is. In February of 2020, the Bank of Canada owned $106 billion of government debt. As of the end of last month, that number had reached $412 billion. That is an increase of almost $300 billion in 1 year. It is also an increase of 300%. Last year, the amount that the Bank of Canada produced for the government by purchasing government debt was over $300 billion. It was the single biggest source of revenue for the government, bigger than income tax, consumption tax, tariffs, and private loans combined. Never before has the Bank of Canada been the single biggest provider of funds for the government's operation. It does this through a process whereby the government sells debt onto the market and the bank buys it back at a higher price. This has the effect of flooding government coffers with cheap credit that it can spend liberally, as it did last year and continues to do right now. But the result, Mr. Speaker, is a massive increase in the money supply. When the Bank of Canada uses its balance sheet to buy government debt, it increases the number of dollars in circulation. In the period since late winter and early spring of 2020, the money supply has increased by over $300 billion. In fact, from February 2020 to February 2021, the money supply grew by $354 billion. The deficit for the last fiscal year was $354 billion. In other words, the same amount the government needed to borrow was the amount that the Bank of Canada created. This led to a 20% year-over-year increase in the number of dollars in coins, bills, and bank deposits. That is the biggest increase since 1974, which was the last time the government went on a money printing binge that led to major inflation crises thereafter. For context, the increase in the money supply is so large that it could fund our armed forces for 10 years. Or, to use another measure, for fully $1 and $6 in the entire M2 money supply has been created in the last year alone. In the fiscal year 2021, the Bank of Canada, as I said, was the single largest source of funds for the Government of Canada. All revenue from other sources was $294 billion. Net new borrowing was $41 billion, but revenue from the bank was $303 billion. You know, Mr. Speaker, $303 billion is an extraordinary and unprecedented sum. And the bank did not do this on its own. Let me now speak about the direct coordination between the government and the bank that led to this massive increase in the money supply. The parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Finance actually said that there was coordination between the bank and the government. And the coincidence that you see in the amount of money printed and the amount of money spent demonstrates this coordination as well. As I pointed out before the interruption, the bank, according to the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Finance, the government has been, quote, coordinating with the central bank to produce these funds, and these funds have been used to spend. Now, the massive dollar figures involved that I mentioned earlier are not only staggering and unprecedented, they may be illegal. In fact, I stumbled on a section of the Bank of Canada Act, Section 18, subsection J, only hours before I was originally planning to make this point of privilege. And having read that section and looked at the numbers, I came to the conclusion that there very well might be a breach of law involved in what the bank and the government have colluded to do. Allow me to read the section in question. Section 18, the bank may, J, make loans to the Government of Canada or the government of any province, but such loans outstanding at any one time shall not, in the case of the Government of Canada, exceed 1/3 of the estimated revenue of the Government of Canada in a fiscal year. I turn your attention, Mr. Speaker, to Table A14, Summary Statement of Transactions, Budget 2021. Projected revenues, $355.1 billion. So to respect Section 18J of the Bank of Canada Act, which limits the bank's ability to lend money to the government to no more than 1/3 of projected budgetary revenues, the bank would be effectively capped in its loans to the government at $118 billion. $118 billion being 1/3 of the $355 billion of projected revenues. In fact, the Bank of Canada balance sheet shows that it now holds $415 billion, almost $300 billion more than the legal cap provided in the Act. Now, when I discovered this apparent breach, I immediately delayed my introduction of this point of privilege to spend the time to verify and re-verify my calculations. I've never seen a government body so flagrantly violate limits that the Parliament has placed upon it in statutory law, so I thought there must be some mistake. But as I crunched the numbers, I realized that no, in fact, the 1/3 limit was breached. I then reached out to the Library of Parliament to conduct a full review of all the legislation passed to approve emergency COVID spending since spring of 2020 to find out if maybe the section was temporarily suspended or a special exemption to it was created in order to allow this kind of dollar figure to be lent from the bank to the government. And sure enough, the Library of Parliament said there was no such exemption or suspension of the section. It is still in place. In other words, this research shows, and I ask that you and your trusted advisors and the officials at the Library of Parliament to verify my claim here, that the Bank of Canada has breached limits that Parliament has imposed on its ability to lend money to the government. Now, these limits do not exist without reason. There is a reason why Parliament chose deliberately to write a section into the Bank of Canada Act limiting the amount of debt the bank could buy. And it is the reason is this, because Parliament foresaw that future governments might try to use the printing presses over at the bank in order to pay for spending that it could not raise through the more normal process of taxation. With the limits Parliament placed on the Bank of Canada's purchase of government debt, Parliament effectively banned the government from raising taxes by inflationary money creation instead of by legal and legitimate taxation. That the government and the bank have circumvented that ban and broken a law of Parliament breaches the privileges of every member of this House to vote on laws that are made and repealed. In the process, the government has breached the principle of the independence of the central bank. This breach is not the result of the independent action of the bank. Let me quote the parliamentary secretary to the finance minister, who said during the appearance of the governor of the Bank of Canada before the Finance Committee on June 16, 2020, and I quote, "There's been an enormous coordination between OSFI, the bank, and the federal government." An enormous coordination. Well, I have given the fiscal and mathematical evidence to show that that coordination has occurred. In fact, not only did it occur last year, when the bank bought effectively 85% of the government's deficit, and wherein the bank increased the money supply by exactly the same amount that the government borrowed in the previous fiscal year. But that quote-unquote enormous coordination has continued into this fiscal year. On April 19th, the Minister of Finance introduced a budget in this House projecting a $154 billion deficit, or borrowing effectively $3 billion a week. 2 days later, the governor of the Bank of Canada held a press conference announcing that his bank would be buying $3 billion a week of government debt. In other words, the government is borrowing $3 billion a week, and the central bank is buying $3 billion a week. The government is running a $155 roughly billion deficit, and the bank is lending roughly $155 billion throughout the year. As I said when I quoted the Oxford Dictionary, a tax has three characteristics: that it is state revenue levied by government, that it adds to the cost of goods and services and transactions, and that it is a compulsory contribution. I have just gone through the first point, in which I have demonstrated that this cash creation is state revenue levied by the government. As I said, the second characteristic of a tax is that it adds to the cost of some goods, services, and transactions. Just today, Statistics Canada released fresh data showing what consumers have known for months: that inflation has rocketed up to 3.6%, well above the Bank of Canada's 2% target. This data was essential to my argument today, thus one of the reasons why I waited for its publication before presenting this point. As of this morning, Mr. Speaker, 3 of 4 measures of the Bank of Canada for inflation show that inflation has breached the 2% target. Several product groups were well above that. Gasoline is up 43.4%. Home ownership replacement costs, 11.3%. And durable goods, which include things like cars, appliances, and furniture, is up 5%, just to name a few. That is demonstrated proof that people are in fact paying the cost of the inflation tax. Food prices are also on sharp rise. According to the latest Canada Food Price Report, food costs increased 2.3% last year, with an expected 4.5 to 6.5% increase in meat. 3.5 to 5.5% increase in bakery, and 4.5 to 6.5% increase in vegetables this year. Housing prices have ballooned 30% from March 2020 to March 2021. Now, this is where the cause and effect is most evident. COVID should have reduced housing prices, Mr. Speaker. The wages with which people buy houses dropped. People lost their jobs, making it harder to place offers on homes. To escape lockdowns, more people moved to the countryside, where prices per square foot are lower. Immigration came to a halt, reducing the number of buyers in the market. All of these factors would have driven demand and therefore prices down. In fact, the country's top housing regulator, CMHC, predicted prices would drop as much as 14% for that reason. And you know what? They did begin to drop in March and April of last year. Then, suddenly, as the Bank of Canada's increase in the money supply began flooding into the market, prices began to reverse. The government pumped $356 billion of brand new, newly created cash into the system, and that was exactly the size of the deficit and the size of the money supply growth. As I was saying, housing prices were dropping until the bank began printing its money. The increase in the money supply flooded into the mortgage system. In the first quarter, from the first quarter 2020 to the first quarter 2021, mortgage lending grew by 41%, and as a result, from April 2020 to April 2021, housing prices went up about 42%. In other words, there's a direct cause and effect relationship between the increase in the money supply and the increase in prices. And this is supported by years of research by academia, Mr. Speaker. Milton Friedman, for example, said, he's an award-winning, Nobel Prize award-winning economist, said inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon.
The honourable member for Carleton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I will continue the point of privilege that I began earlier. As I have demonstrated, the government's decision to use printed money to pay its bills has driven up the cost of living for Canadians and increased inflation of key essentials, effectively creating the exact same conditions as a tax would on the population. Now, I will, before we hear responses from the government claiming that this money printing is for some purpose other than generating government funds for spending, let me quickly address the pretext, the false pretexts that the Bank of Canada and the government have ostensibly used to justify this money printing bonanza. First, the Bank of Canada told the Finance Committee in the spring of 2020 that the program of purchasing government debt was designed to restore order in credit and capital markets. In fairness to the bank, there was disorder in the markets at that narrow period of time in March of 2020 as the world was responding to the sudden shock of the COVID closures. The bank noted at the time that there were large gaps, there was a large what's called buy-ask spread in bond markets, which effectively means that sellers of bonds were asking significantly more than buyers were willing to pay, and as a result, these markets were seizing up, threatening the ability of governments to raise cash and for markets to function. That was the case in late March of 2020, but it only lasted about 10 days. That bid-ask spread vanished by early April, at which point bond prices not only began trading freely on public markets, but also began increasing at extraordinary paces. The bond prices began to inflate as central banks in general, but our central bank in particular, began buying them at an unprecedented pace. Furthermore, capital markets, while they did take a sudden drop in late March of that same year, had more than recovered by summer. And in fact, today, our capital markets are higher than they've ever been. In fact, the Standard & Poor's TSX, which is the largest index of Canadian stocks, rose in market value above the size of our entire GDP for the first time in Canadian history, and now I think stands somewhere around 125% of GDP, reaching record heights. Furthermore, as I have demonstrated, mortgage issuances have reached records, and they rose faster than ever before in our history. The amount of cash in people's and businesses' bank accounts has increased by $200 billion. In other words, the absence of liquidity or the seizing up of capital and credit markets can no longer be used as a justification to continue printing money and pumping it into the financial system. Now we have more cash circulating in markets, both credit and capital, than ever before, and more liquidity in the hands of businesses and households than ever before. Therefore, the claim that money printing is just designed in order to protect the liquidity of capital and credit markets is demonstrably false. Further evidence that it is false is the fact that the central bank has since changed its explanation for why it needed to continue printing money. It claimed then that it wanted to avoid disinflation or deflation. Apparently, this was the great risk they told us would result from COVID. However, as the evidence I've already presented demonstrates, there is no disinflation or deflation anywhere except perhaps in movie theaters and airplane tickets, because people are banned from effectively buying either of them. So aside from those areas of the economy for which purchases are actually banned by local authorities for public health purposes, everything is actually increasing in prices. The Bank of Canada and the government have then claimed that the reason why they must continue to expand the money supply, print cash, and provide it to the government is to avoid deflation or disinflation, which they identified as a great threat from COVID. But as I was saying, there is no evidence that either of these threats have manifested themselves. Outside of sectors for which consumers are banned to spend their money, like airlines and movie theaters, effectively, there is inflation everywhere, inflation. And in fact, as I said, inflation has now exceeded not only the 2% target of the Bank of Canada, but the 1% to 3% acceptable range for inflation. So we are well out of the woods of any concern that we're going to plunge this year or any time in the immediate future into a deflationary spiral. So that cannot be the justification. And finally, the Bank of Canada has claimed that it is continuing to print money because unemployment remains high. And now it is true that unemployment is high. We are the second highest employment region in the G7. But there is absolutely no evidence, historical or present, that printing money will do anything about that at all. Money printing has never created jobs, and in fact, if the Bank of Canada were to look upon its own history, in the 1970s, when it began a similar program of money creation, the result was higher unemployment that reached 12%, inflation that also reached 12%, and then later interest rates to quell that inflation reaching 20%. That was the stagnation crisis of the early 80s that, I might add, left us with not just the worst economic situation since the Depression, but also the highest suicide rate among Canadians. In other words, fighting unemployment cannot be the justification for printing money. In quite the contrary, it makes no sense. So that leaves one explanation for the ongoing money printing, and that is that it is intended to fund government operations. Now, it is standard and customary, Mr. Chair, for a member making claims of a breach of privilege of this type to rely on expert witness evidence. That is to say, to rely on the scientists and others who know the facts, the way that they would testify as expert witnesses in a court of law. And so I will bring to your attention the views on this specific matter of the inflation tax of the most renowned economic scientists in the history of the world. I will start with a 1978 lecture from Nobel laureate economic scientist. Will I then address the third and final characteristic of a tax, which is that it is compulsory. This inflation tax is obviously compulsory. If you do not pay the inflation tax, you can't buy food, which has gone up in price. You cannot buy housing, which has gone up in price. You cannot buy clothing, which has gone up in price. You cannot buy any of the essentials. The only way to avoid paying this inflation tax is to freeze, starve, and go without fuel to power your life. In other words, other than to die, you have to pay the costs that are applied. And the only alternative to that would be to violate a federal statute in the criminal code that bans people from stealing. Because that is, again, the only way to get around paying the inflated prices that governments have imposed upon people. So this inflation has all of the three defining characteristics of a tax as provided in the Oxford Dictionary. One, basically that it raises money, a levy for the government. Two, that it is paid by the people. And three, that it is compulsory. It is all three of those things. Now, the tradition of requiring every tax increase that is imposed on the population come before Parliament is one that dates back 800 years to the Magna Carta. It is probably the reason we have Parliament, Mr. Chair. The number one point of tension between the commoner and the king has been on the king's insatiable appetite for tax revenue and the commoner's desire to resist that appetite and protect his or the fruits of his or her labor. If you are to rule that governments are allowed to do indirectly what they cannot do directly, that is to say, print money to fund their spending and pass on the costs through higher inflation to the population, you will effectively be setting a staggering precedent whereby governments can violate the principle of no taxation without representation by simply going around the parliamentary legislation and raising taxes through the creation of cash. I finally point out that the reason for this rule, Mr. Chair, is not just to stop government from taking too much, but to stop it from taking from the wrong places. This is a tax we would never approve because it falls heaviest on those with the least and in a roundabout way, by inflating their assets, improves the fortunes of those with the most. If you were to put before, in conclusion, if you were to put before this House a proposition to raise taxes on the poorest people in the land in order to increase the wealth of the most affluent people in the land and provide government with unlimited ability to spend, that would be voted down nearly unanimously, because there's not a person in this chamber that would have the guts to go back to their constituents and defend such a voting decision. That is precisely why we have this precedent. It is why we have the privilege and the duty to vote on every single tax increase. I ask you to uphold these ancient English liberties that make Parliament relevant and that make this country a place of the commoners, not of the crown. Thank you.